6,600 miles. That is the approximate distance between a quiet diner in rural Texas and the center of a myth that has circulated through American folklore for more than a century. By the end, you will understand why the popular story is wrong. People tell the story in a simple way. A traveler stops at a roadside diner somewhere in Texas, late at night, maybe around midnight. The place is empty except for a quiet stranger sitting at the counter. They talk. The stranger knows too much, knows the traveler's past, knows things nobody should know. And when the traveler leaves, someone tells them the truth. You just met the devil. Stories like that travel fast because they fit neatly inside older traditions of American folklore. Encounters with mysterious strangers go back centuries. In the American South and Southwest, the devil often appears as a polite man in ordinary clothes. A lesser-known detail, folklore records collected in Texas between 1936 and 1941 by the Federal Writers Project contain more than 300 reported stories of supernatural encounters, but none involve diners specifically, because roadside diners did not become common in rural Texas until after World War II. The popular version of the story feels believable because diners themselves are cultural symbols. Late hours, empty booths, strangers passing through. The environment encourages imagination. Another rarely mentioned fact, by 1955, there were roughly 6,000 roadside diners operating across the United States, and more than 40% of them stayed open past midnight to serve truck drivers and shift workers. When people remember strange conversations that happened late at night, memory fills in the gaps. Human memory is not a recording device. It reconstructs events. A lesser-known finding from cognitive psychology studies in the 1970s showed that witnesses can unintentionally add details to memories after hearing similar stories from others, increasing the perceived certainty of events that never occurred. So the legend grows. The first claim usually sounds like this: the devil appears in human form and tests people in small moments of temptation. It sounds plausible because religious tradition has long described supernatural beings walking unnoticed among humans. Yet historical evidence of these encounters is surprisingly thin. A rarely mentioned fact, church disciplinary records from Texas Baptist congregations between 1880 and 1920 contain hundreds of accounts of moral failure, but none attribute the cause to a literal physical encounter with Satan. Another version of the claim says the devil reveals secret knowledge. The traveler hears things only an all-knowing entity could know. That detail sounds convincing because coincidence feels supernatural when it happens unexpectedly. Yet statistical probability tells another story. A lesser-known fact, in casual conversation between strangers, roughly 60% of information exchanged involves common life experiences, work, travel, family structure, which makes correct guesses far easier than people assume. Imagine the setting more closely. A small diner outside Amarillo. Population of the town maybe 4,000. A truck stop nearby. A stranger sits at the counter and asks the traveler where they are from. The traveler answers vaguely. The stranger guesses something about farming or oil work. The odds favor accuracy because in large regions of Texas, those industries dominate employment. An overlooked detail, in 1970, more than 1.2 million jobs in Texas were connected either directly or indirectly to petroleum extraction and refining. The myth gains strength because it contains emotional tension. People want to believe that moral tests happen in dramatic moments, yet most moral decisions occur in ordinary settings with ordinary consequences. A lesser-known observation from sociological research, more than 80% of reported ethical dilemmas in workplace studies involve routine financial or interpersonal choices rather than dramatic confrontations. Another claim often appears in the story. The stranger disappears suddenly, leaving behind a sense of dread. That part feels supernatural because unexplained absence suggests power. But diners are places of constant movement. People leave without saying goodbye all the time. A small operational fact, rarely mentioned,
During peak overnight hours in highway diners, average customer stay time is only about 18 minutes. Consider a battlefield comparison. Soldiers sometimes report encounters with mysterious figures during periods of extreme stress. Later investigation often reveals ordinary explanations: another soldier, a civilian, a misunderstood shadow. A lesser-known statistic: during the First World War, more than 2,000 British soldiers reported seeing angelic figures during the retreat of Mons in 1914. But historians later traced many of those reports to fictional newspaper story published months earlier. Human expectation shapes perception. The diner legend also borrows from an older American myth involving crossroads. The devil meets musicians and offers talent in exchange for a price. The famous story attached to blues musician Robert Johnson helped popularize the idea. Yet historical documentation of Johnson's life contains no first-hand evidence of a supernatural bargain. A lesser-known fact: the crossroads narrative only appeared widely after Johnson's death in 1938, when fellow musicians began repeating the story in interviews. Another version claims that the devil appears during moments of personal crisis. The traveler might be thinking about divorce, debt, or regret. Suddenly, a stranger arrives and speaks directly to that fear. That sounds uncanny, but it reflects something simpler. Many people carry visible signs of stress: posture, tone of voice, hesitation. A lesser-known observation from behavioral research: trained interviewers can correctly identify emotional distress in strangers roughly 70% of the time, based only on body language. In a quiet diner, conversation becomes personal quickly. Two strangers sharing coffee at 2 a.m. often talk more openly than they would in daylight. A small sociological detail: late-night service workers report that customers between midnight and 3 a.m. are more likely to share personal stories than those during daytime hours. The myth also depends on isolation. The traveler feels alone, no witnesses. But most Texas highways are far less empty than legends suggest. A transportation statistic rarely mentioned: Interstate 40 across Texas carries more than 20,000 vehicles per day in many segments, including heavy overnight trucking traffic. Another popular belief says that supernatural encounters happen in places of moral ambiguity: bars, roadside stops, deserted buildings. In reality, stories concentrate there because those places create uncertainty. A lesser-known psychological effect called the uncertainty amplification bias shows that humans interpret ambiguous environments as more mysterious or threatening than familiar ones. Think about the diner again: fluorescent lights buzzing softly, coffee machine running, maybe an old jukebox in the corner. These details matter because sensory environments affect perception. A small environmental fact: low-frequency electrical hum from lighting fixtures can produce mild feelings of unease in some individuals. One version of the story insists that the stranger offers a deal: knowledge, wealth, success, in exchange for something undefined. That theme comes directly from European folklore traditions dating back hundreds of years. A lesser-known historical note: the Faust legend, one of the most famous devil bargain stories, was first printed in Germany in 1587 as a cautionary tale about forbidden knowledge. But diners in Texas are not crossroads of supernatural commerce. They are crossroads of logistics: truck drivers stopping for fuel, oil workers finishing shifts, travelers covering long distances. An operational detail: the average long-haul truck driver in the United States drives roughly 2,500 miles per week. People meeting in such places are strangers by design. Another myth claims that the devil appears calm and polite. That detail is repeated often because it contrasts with the expectation of a terrifying demon. Yet politeness is a common social strategy among strangers. A lesser-known sociological finding: individuals interacting with strangers are significantly more likely to display exaggerated courtesy compared to interactions among friends. Imagine a scenario where the myth collapses under ordinary reality. A traveler enters a diner at 1:30 a.m. after driving 400 miles. Fatigue begins to affect perception. Sleep deprivation reduces cognitive accuracy. A little-known medical fact, after about 20 hours without sleep, cognitive impairment can resemble the effects of a blood alcohol level of 0.08%. The traveler talks to a stranger. The stranger guesses a few things correctly, maybe mentions regret or ambition or fear, universal topics. The traveler leaves feeling unsettled. Days later, the memory grows sharper. Details become symbolic. The stranger becomes something else. Stories evolve this way because they serve emotional purposes. They warn people about temptation. They dramatize conscience. A lesser-known cultural fact, many American urban legends function primarily as moral instruction rather than historical record. The deeper driver behind these myths is not supernatural belief alone. It is the human need to
3 minutes. That is the average time it takes for two strangers in a quiet restaurant to move from small talk to personal topics if the conversation is uninterrupted. By the end, you will understand why the story of meeting the devil in a Texas diner survives not because of supernatural evidence, but because ordinary human systems make it feel convincing. The story usually continues the same way. The traveler cannot stop thinking about the conversation. Something about the stranger felt calculated, almost rehearsed. That detail makes the encounter seem deliberate, yet deliberate behavior is common among people who spend long hours around strangers. A lesser-known occupational fact, truck drivers and traveling sales workers often develop conversational routines designed to open dialogue quickly with unfamiliar people. Those routines matter. Someone who has repeated the same opening questions thousands of times becomes extremely good at reading reactions. A small social statistic. Individuals who work in customer-facing roles for more than 10 years demonstrate significantly higher ability to detect emotional tone in conversation compared with the general population. Now imagine that stranger sitting at the counter. They might not be supernatural at all. They might simply be someone accustomed to talking with hundreds of travelers every year. A rarely mentioned detail from highway culture. Long-haul truck drivers can interact with more than 1,000 different people annually at fuel stops, diners, and loading docks. Practice builds intuition. Another piece of the myth says the stranger knew things that were never spoken aloud. That claim sounds extraordinary until one considers how much information leaks through ordinary behavior. A lesser-known behavioral study found that posture, clothing wear patterns, and speech rhythm reveal subtle clues about profession, income stability, and stress level. Boot wear patterns alone can indicate occupation. Oil-filled boots accumulate a specific type of residue containing drilling mud and clay, a small industrial detail. Drilling operations in Texas use bentonite clay mixtures that leave a distinct pale gray dust on surfaces. A careful observer might recognize that. The myth then introduces a turning point. The stranger says something that seems directed at the traveler's deepest fear. That line becomes the centerpiece of the story when it is retold. Yet fear itself is predictable. A lesser-known psychological survey conducted across several U.S. states found that the three most common personal anxieties among adults were financial stability, relationship failure, and health decline. Mention any one of those topics, and the probability of emotional reaction increases sharply. In quiet environments, the effect becomes stronger. Sound levels in late-night diners often drop below 40 decibels. A rarely discussed environmental fact, low ambient noise levels increase the perceived intensity of spoken words. The same sentence spoken in a loud room feels casual. In a silent room, it feels heavy. This is why nighttime conversations often feel more meaningful than daytime ones. Another element of the myth involves timing. The encounter almost always happens after midnight. That timing is not accidental. Human perception changes dramatically during those hours. A lesser-known biological fact, between roughly 1 a.m. and 4 a.m., body temperature and alertness levels reach their lowest point in the circadian cycle. Decision-making ability declines during that window. Memory accuracy declines as well. A traveler who has been driving since early morning might be experiencing mild cognitive fatigue without realizing it. A small transportation statistic. Highway safety studies show that driver reaction time slows measurably after about 8 hours of continuous driving. Fatigue does not just affect driving, it affects interpretation.
so the stranger's words feel sharper than they actually are. Another myth claims the devil appears polite, even charming. That detail repeats across dozens of retellings. The explanation is simpler. Charm is a social strategy used by people who interact frequently with strangers. A lesser-known communication principle shows that individuals who maintain steady eye contact and controlled speaking pace are often perceived as more trustworthy regardless of their actual intentions. Confidence changes perception. Now consider a scenario. A traveler sits at a diner counter around 2:40 a.m. The stranger next to them has spent years talking with people on the road. They ask simple questions and listen carefully. The traveler responds with more detail than intended. 10 minutes pass. The stranger now knows the traveler's job, destination, approximate income range, and perhaps even relationship problems. No supernatural knowledge required. Yet the myth grows stronger when the traveler leaves the diner. Memory begins to compress events into symbols. A rarely mentioned cognitive process called gist memory causes the brain to remember the overall meaning of an experience rather than precise details. The meaning becomes the story. Another important factor is narrative tradition. The American Southwest has long contained folklore about supernatural wanderers. Spanish colonial stories told of El Diablo appearing along lonely roads, a lesser-known historical detail. Many Mexican folk traditions describe the devil appearing as a well-dressed gentleman who engages travelers in conversation before revealing his true nature. Cultural blending matters. Texas folklore absorbed elements from Spanish, Mexican, and Anglo-American storytelling traditions. By the late 19th century, roadside diners replaced older crossroads and taverns as the setting of these encounters. Infrastructure shapes mythology. A small historical statistic illustrates the shift. Between 1950 and 1980, the number of registered automobiles in the United States grew from about 40 million to more than 120 million. More travelers meant more roadside stories. More roadside stories meant more roadside diners. The diner myth also benefits from emotional framing. When someone tells a story about meeting the devil, listeners pay attention immediately. A lesser-known communication finding shows that narratives involving supernatural threats generate stronger listener engagement than ordinary travel stories. Engagement keeps the story alive. But the myth rarely includes mundane details. No one remembers how much the coffee cost. No one remembers the brand of napkin dispenser. Those details disappear because they do not support the narrative. War historians see the same pattern in combat recollections. Soldiers often remember moments of danger vividly while forgetting routine logistics that surrounded those moments. A rarely discussed statistic from battlefield studies shows that logistical factors such as supply delays and transportation breakdowns influence outcomes in more than half of major military operations. Yet those details rarely appear in dramatic war stories. Stories prefer heroes and villains. Urban legends prefer supernatural encounters. Another part of the myth claims the stranger leaves a cryptic warning, something about consequences or fate. That line gives the story a moral lesson. A lesser-known feature of urban legend structure is that nearly all successful legends contain an implied warning about behavior. Do not trust strangers. Do not travel alone at night. Do not ignore intuition. The devil in the diner becomes the messenger of that warning. But reality remains more ordinary. Consider again how information flows during conversation. People reveal far more about themselves than they realize. A small linguistic detail. The average adult uses between 120 and 150 words per minute in casual speech. In 10 minutes of conversation, that equals more than 1,200 words. Hidden inside those words are dozens of clues. Where someone grew up, what they worry about, what they regret. A skilled listener can extract patterns quickly. Another overlooked factor is the power of coincidence. Humans encounter coincidences regularly, but remember only the unusual ones. A lesser-known probability insight shows that even rare events become likely when millions of interactions occur every day. Thousands of roadside conversations happen nightly across the United States. Eventually, one of them feels uncanny. That single moment becomes a story retold for years. Now step back and examine the deeper mechanism. The diner legend combines 4 systems working together. Environment creates isolation. Fatigue alters perception.
Conversation reveals personal information. Culture provides a supernatural explanation. Each system reinforces the others. A rarely mentioned anthropological observation explains why such stories endure. Humans organize experience through narrative structures that simplify complex events into clear moral patterns. Meeting the devil is one of the oldest patterns. It converts confusion into meaning. War provides a similar lesson. Soldiers often believe that battles turn on heroic moments or sudden decisions, yet military historians repeatedly find that outcomes usually depend on slower forces like logistics, training, and communication networks. The dramatic moment is only the visible surface. The hidden system underneath explains the result. The diner myth works the same way. The dramatic surface is the mysterious stranger. The hidden system is human psychology. Consider the final chain of cause and effect. A traveler drives hundreds of miles through the night. Fatigue and isolation increase emotional sensitivity. The traveler enters a quiet diner where conversation flows easily. A stranger skilled in reading people asks ordinary questions. Personal information emerges quickly. Later, memory reconstructs the encounter using familiar cultural stories about supernatural tests. The result feels profound. Yet every step follows natural processes. No supernatural visitor required. The real lesson of the story is not about the devil at all. It is about how humans search for meaning when ordinary events feel strange. War teaches historians something similar. In the chaos of battle, people grasp for explanations that feel personal and intentional, but the truth usually lies in systems, patterns, and probabilities rather than individual moments. The same logic applies here. A traveler met a stranger in a diner. They talked. One person listened carefully.